Well, thank you very much, Wei, for having me, and to Michelle, if she's still on, for making this happen, and to everybody for joining today. This is really an exciting opportunity for me to think about issues that I've been really struggling with for a long time. And I feel like certainly, as you'll see, Wei has already helped me make more progress just today with his incredible questions that we'll start with that I could in a month without. So I'm hoping that input from more on this Zoom will help even further. So I want to say that I'm delighted to have Atia helping me in this project, working with me in this project. And her input is really valuable, and you'll see why. It'll take a while to get to her part, but that's not to suggest it's the least important part. I think it's actually the most important part of this project, and I think you'll see why as we get there. So hold tight for that. Okay, so I will start now. I'm going to start with the questions that Wei asked, and I think that these are edited versions. They were longer or more thoughtful. I've just edited them to put on the screen, but I think they're a great way to start. So the first question he asked is an important one, as you'll see. He asked about the distinction between the individual-oriented tax havens and corporate tax havens. He asked whether these are important, and certainly in the piece, I don't really emphasize that distinction. And in fact, that's the problem that I'm trying to identify. And I think you'll see why that's true. But it's a great question, unsurprisingly, going right to the heart of it. He then asked whether there are effective unilateral instruments to deal with multinational tax avoidance. Absolutely true. And Wei, will you populate the chat with those items if you can?
Absolutely, I'm going to do that right now.
So, and I won't take credit for this this one question 2 link. So I've added a few links that Wei is going to post to the chat. The one for question 2 is one he suggested, and that's absolutely true. There are certainly unilateral ways to deal with multinational tax avoidance, and the paper he cites that Demika Dharmapala wrote lays that out quite clearly and eloquently. He also asked whether you can make the same arguments by the individual side, and for that, I would cite to Reuven Aviona's original piece on these questions. I think that he was exactly right, that there's a relatively easy way for non-OECD countries, or for OECD countries, to solve this problem without any help from non-OECD countries. It was a point he made, now more than 20 years ago, that often seems to be lost in this. And this is a more difficult question that we're going to get to later on. But I acknowledge that there is a sort of a third category of questions that relate to topics like GILTI. And I talk about GILTI in the paper and in a related paper that's coming out of the Pittsburgh Tax Review soonish. But I really am trying to understand how this, the central topic that we're talking about of tax havens has really even influenced things like GILTI, and I think in an unproductive way. And I'll explain why. I talk about why I think FATCA is a helpful or correct type of policy. And that's a fair question. I think I'm going to need to work up to that, but that I think is a point I will try to address. And again, another great question from Wei. And Wei also says, and I agree with him, that there is a great story here about the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus. And I definitely am grateful for my excellent research assistant, Kalina Hans, who helped me figure that out. Going ahead too fast. But there's a related piece. It's also now in the chat from Tax Notes, but it's really in the European Fiscal Review, but Tax Notes agreed to publish it early after the George Floyd murders, when I really thought it would be helpful for people in tax to be able to have some way of understanding, acknowledging, the proud history of the Congressional Black Caucus, and it's been great. So I will say as well, happy Black History Month to everybody. This is a month in the U.S. where we celebrate Black history. I'm wearing one of my fun T-shirts. It says "Love Black people like you love black coffee," from a cool coffee shop that I've never been to, but I like their t-shirt. So happy Black History Month to everybody. All right, so let's get started. So we're going to start with the big framing. And this is, I think, the most difficult part of the project. And it's certainly not in the piece, except in the subtext, but sometimes it's helpful to frame it this way. So this is a quote from an article about unconscious racism and the racial achievement gap. So the question that's often asked in the US is why, especially Black students, struggle in the classroom, and you see that at every level, starting when students are very young, and it just gets worse and worse, or the problems compound until you're in, say, a law program or an econ PhD program. I read some statistic yesterday, or was on a Zoom, that there were, I don't know, it was something terrifying, like a dozen Black women graduated from PhD programs in the US, econ PhD programs last year. That can't be true, but it was something terrifying like that. And so the question is, what's driving that, right? I think we could all agree that it's not the nature story, right? It's not that Black people are not as smart as everybody else. I think there would not be anybody on the Zoom who would need to engage that narrative. But there are two other stories that Charles Lawrence raises, and he talks about the culture story and the structure story. So structural racism is something that I think we all have at least heard about, even if it's not something as tax people we spend a lot of time thinking about. And the culture story is also something that I think as tax scholars and tax policymakers and tax lawyers, we probably have some susceptibility to, but probably not if we thought about it too hard, that we would really believe it. But what I'm trying to do in this project is put to rest the culture story of tax havens. I think there's a structural problem that tax havens represent. And since my earliest writings, I've been trying to offer structural solutions to the tax haven problem. But I find, and it's really quite surprising at times, that I'm met with this cultural story. The sort of pushback I get suggests that the structural solutions that I'm advocating, one of my favorites that I really, I meant only semi-seriously, was that if we thought that tax havens, especially the individual kind, were costing the US $70 billion of tax revenues, and they're tiny and relatively poor countries, we could offer to split that with them for a limited amount of time, with the understanding that after that, we'd really get tough with them. And I never really quite thought that would happen, but what I wanted people to understand was that this was a structural problem, not a cultural problem. This was not that these tax havens were somehow out to get us, or as one OECD spokesman was quoted in the New York Times as saying, that they're gangsters. That's a strange thing to say, and I just think that has been a pernicious element of the tax haven discussion ever since. And this is how I want to illustrate this concept. So this is taken from The Guardian earlier. You can tell from the headline what this was, but The Guardian, a quite liberal media source, chooses to illustrate its tax haven stories, right? Whenever it's a tax haven story, I think they illustrate it with this beach. And this is somehow, I don't really know how to articulate it, but the notion that you can evoke the concept of tax havens, which includes, even in these headlines, the Channel Islands. I'm pretty sure this is not a picture of the Channel Islands. No offense to the Channel Islands. But this notion that there's something essential about an island that is typically majority Black, a former colony, that makes it essentially that something about that is meaningful when we talk about tax havens. So you'll see a lot of books about tax havens illustrated with a beach, a lot of news articles illustrated this way, and sometimes news stories. And this is just the Guardian standard thing. And this to me really this is a small thing, right? This doesn't matter. I'm not saying that this is something that you should really be worried about, but I offer it here as an illustration of how pervasive this culture story is, right? That there is something about tax havens, whatever kind, whether you're talking about the corporate side as way distinguishes from the individual side, if that's correct. But what they're talking about, the EU blacklist, is about the corporate side, right? They're not talking about the individual side, they're talking about the corporate side. But this culture story that tax havens somehow are driving the problem, and that it's a certain, this is not Switzerland. I'm pretty sure they're not. This is not a beach in Switzerland or in Luxembourg, not much less the Channel Islands. But this is how they illustrate the EU tax haven blacklist is, I think, really a problem. It is not in itself a problem, but it's emblematic of the broader problem. The fact that we think about this as a culture story, not a structure story. So I want you to sort of cast your minds back to if your memory of tax havens and tax policy goes back this far, what tax havens were, what they sort of evoked before 2000. So before 2000, I grew up in the Bahamas, which is how I came to this topic. Now, before 2000, you might encounter a story like this. So there was a Nassau, Bahamas-based bank called the Castle Bank and Trust. And there was a great story. It's in the Washington Post, and there were congressional hearings about it. So a banker's briefcase was searched and the contents photographed while he was lured out to dinner by a woman. It turns out that this is actually one of the CIA's finance channels for Operation against Cuba. So, this is a completely different era, right? This is what sort of this tax haven narrative was before 2000. If not, it's not that there's nothing criminal here. It's not that there's nothing menacing here, but it was certainly not the same sort of story that we had after 2000, right? This was a very different way of thinking about what tax havens represented. So then we got the war on tax havens. In 2000, that was when the narrative shifted, and it was quite a conscious effort. So you can see here, I'm quoting from J.C. Sharman's book, Havens in a Storm. And in that book, Sharman tells sort of the definitive history of the what he calls the failure of the OECD effort. He sees it as defeat by the OECD at the hands of these small island nations, and he's really curious as to how that happened. And he has a sort of a certain understanding of how it unfolded. But what the story that he tells is that this was the shift was driven heavily by the U.S. And he specifically identifies Larry Summers as somebody who thought this was an effective or appropriate way to approach this. And he also specifies that this was not something that ended after what he calls the failure of the OECD effort. And it continued on, just sort of inflected by the terror attacks, but it's still becoming a sort of a threat posed by jurisdictions, not a threat that involved tax havens. So tax havens were no longer sort of implicated in this problem. They were the problem, right? And they were these islands that were implicated in this really quite imminent and dangerous threat to really to everything, really an existential threat posed by these jurisdictions. And that's strange when you look at the jurisdictions that are on the list, right? So you look at the list of jurisdictions here that are existential threats to the OECD, and it's really quite jarring, right? And it's jarring in a lot of ways. I see the Bahamas on there, and I know that I grew up there. I can say these things. These guys can't keep the power on. If you think the Bahamas is threatening your global tax system, you've got a terrible global tax system. That is really strange. The idea that they are an existential threat is really quite odd. But now we come to what I call the Liberia problem. right? So also on this list, the fact that Bahamas is on this list, I get it. We can have this conversation about that. That's problematic, but it's not completely unfair, right? That's not completely unfair. The Bahamas in grade school, we learn about Bahamian history, and that involves Blackbeard, whose tower was just down the road from where I grew up. We also were involved in running the northern blockade of the South during the U.S. Civil War. There's a terrible history of drug running in the 1970s, 1980s. So there are a lot of bad things that the Bahamas has been involved in. I accept that. But when you look at the list and you see that Liberia is on the list, I really am troubled, right? That to me, and I just recently came across a really beautiful picture of a Liberian beach in a New York Times story about their coastline, and it made me a little wonder a little bit. But in 2000, I know this because I've been working on when I was in practice, I've been working on a pro bono matter that involved a Liberian client. He was seeking asylum in the U.S. He was persecuted by Charles Taylor's government. So I happen to know much more than your typical tax lawyer would about Liberia. So when I look at this list and I see Liberia on this list, and I think when it was on the list, it might have been in a brief respite between long periods of really brutal, incredibly brutal civil war. And when you look at the blacklist, and these are the threats that are being identified to the OECD, and on this list is a country that really shares, it's preposterous to think that they could be viewed as a threat. I understand how the OECD got to this list, right? There were the 4 objective criteria: low or no income tax, no exchange of information, and so on. So it was not, I don't think this was, and again, I don't think this is sort of the nature story, but it really is more of the culture story when you get a list of, not always small. Liberia is bigger in population than Switzerland, I think, or at least comparable. So it's not small places, but a lot of places with, an entirely or largely Black population that happen not to have income taxes for structural reasons, and happen not to exchange information for structural reasons, not because they don't believe in it or they don't have the political will to do it. There are real structural explanations for this. You come up with this list, which is deeply problematic, and I'll briefly touch on the story of how the underrated role, underexplored role of the Congressional Black Caucus caused this effort to unravel in a quite spectacular way. So shifting ahead to 10 years after this. So 10 years after this, we got what I would describe as a structural solution to the tax haven problem, right? Rather than the more cultural approach, thinking that these jurisdictions needed to be named and shamed because they were not on our team. There was something that they were choosing not to, or to do or not to do, rather than facing a structural problem. We got FATCA. And so where do I see FATCA coming from? One of the things that I did, and again, with help from that great RA, I unraveled the story of the pair of letters. So there was a famous letter that the Congressional Black Caucus sent to Paul O'Neill, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, in the spring of 2000. So about 2001. So almost exactly 20 years ago. The letter that everybody knows about was a letter that was signed by a majority, but not all, of the Congressional Black Caucus, and was sent to Paul O'Neill opposing the blacklist. And that was a letter that certainly Sharman and others have attributed to so right-wing agitators either tricking or bullying the Congressional Black Caucus into signing and sending. And so Sharman, for example, says that all of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus signed the letter as a way of implying that they didn't really take it seriously. But that's not the case. It was a majority, but not all of the Congressional Black Caucus that signed that March 14th letter. And among those that signed it were Charles Rangel, and he had just spent years negotiating an African free trade agreement. So I haven't spoken with him about it, but I like to imagine him being presented with this list and seeing Liberia, which he would have cause to know was absolutely not a threat to the U.S. In any way, and deciding that he was not going to participate in this. He was going to sign this letter. And what's important is that the letter that nobody focuses on or noticed, and it's understandable, was written 2 days before. A very similar letter was written 2 days before by another member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she sent it on her own. This was a congressional delegate from the U.S. Virgin Islands, because they were on that list along with Liberia and a few others in the Bahamas. And it was her congressional district, right? So if you look at that one letter that Charles Rangel and many other high-profile people sent that have no direct link to this, people assumed incorrectly that they had been sort of tricked or duped or forced into doing this. But if you look at the letter that was sent 2 days earlier by their colleague Donna Christensen on her own about her own congressional district, the narrative shifts, right? And I see this as the moment where this culture story was first successfully challenged, where the Congressional Black Caucus looked at this list and this effort to, and this was originally not about naming and shaming. The 2000 list was intended as a precursor to sanctions, right? So the Congressional Black Caucus looked at this list to throw sanctions against the district of one of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and other jurisdictions that they had reason to know because of their work were entirely innocent and were going to suffer greatly if the sanctions went into effect, and they objected to it. So shortly after the second letter to Paul O'Neill, Paul O'Neill publicly withdrew from the OECD effort, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Times, really quite snarky about the OECD effort. And generally when the US retreat is described, it's described as a shift away from the Democrats to the Republicans, but that doesn't really quite fit the timeline of what happened, and certainly is not reflecting the efforts of the Congressional Black Caucus. And so, that's to me the rejection of the cultural story of tax havens. But FATCA represents an understanding to me that there was a real structural problem that could be solved. And the structural problem that was solved was, of course, solved not by threatening states, but by forcing banks to provide information, right? So FATCA told offshore financial institutions everywhere, that if you don't provide information on U.S. taxpayers, we're going to impose, extraordinary penalties. Not on, remember, it wasn't payments related to a U.S. taxpayer. It was just all payments made out of the U.S. to these financial institutions. That is an existential threat, right? A bank could not, I think, survive that kind of punishment. So that is what FATCA did. It rejected both the cultural story, and it also rejected, so this is a formula, I'll just run through it. So the Bloody Rangel Amendment, Charles Rangel had sponsored years before an effort to end apartheid by denying foreign tax credits to American companies operating in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela told him, he happily cites in his autobiography, that it was called the Bloody Rangel Amendment because they were so mad about it. It had such an impact. So this is an episode of using tax policy, international tax policy, in a way that it often is not, normally is not, used for openly political ends. So Charles Rangel certainly knew how to do this. Knew how to use the tax law to produce policies in this way. Obama had promised to crack down on international tax abuses, and this also fits into it. Of course, quite helpfully, one of the jurisdictions that had not been on the 2000 list was Switzerland. Had the year before this all started, had been involved in the Swiss banking scandal. So that really helped shift attention from jurisdictions, certainly the jurisdictions on the list, the 2000 list, to banks, right? The shift from some unlucky jurisdictions to everywhere, and the shift from states to banks, to me, was a really anti-racist policy, right? So it wasn't, it was really a way of shifting the narrative away from this cultural story that these rogue states, often Black, were, resisting being good teammates with the rest of the world and understanding that it was really a structural problem. And the asterisk there, this is a quote from Mark Everson, the IRS commissioner. They described the state of information exchange. And of course, we still call what's happening information exchange, even though what's happening now is an entirely different creature than the information exchange that happened before FATCA, right? Before FATCA, he describes what the U.S. got from its information exchange partners. He describes old and useless magnetic tapes in foreign languages, not even describing always a U.S. Taxable event, just not very helpful. And FATCA just completely transformed that, and I think in a way that really understood, acknowledged, recognized that this was a structural, not a cultural problem. And this is where we get to why I'm so happy to know people like Wei and people like Atia. So, I have a bee in my bonnet, let's say, to be polite, about the cultural versus the structural story of tax havens. But what Atia helped me see is that this is really part of a much larger story, right? I think that, and I think this call may be an exception, having both me and Wei in this call makes it an unusual one for international tax policy. People who are not white and have experience in other jurisdictions, and certainly in the US, is extremely rare. I don't know how that is in some of the jurisdictions that are represented on this call, but there's a paper written by Alice Abreu and Richard Greenstein, and I know her. I know Alice, professor at Temple. She told me that the original title of the article, although they decided it was too provocative, was "Why is Tax So White?" They changed the title to something a little less, a little more innocuous. I think it was Rebranding Tax. And she noted that tax in the US tax law is just incredibly non-diverse. And to me, the persistence of the cultural story in international taxation, specifically about tax havens, is a function in part of a lack of diversity. I think if there was more diversity, I think one of the best things that happened to the OECD ever was that Donna Christensen was a non-voting member of Congress from one of the jurisdictions on that list, because I can only imagine what would have happened had the OECD actually imposed sanctions on Liberia for being a tax haven. Maybe I'm worrying too much, but I can imagine just the blowback from actually succeeding would have been much worse than the blowback from failing. So you actually had the ability of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus look at this list and see why it would be a problem, and they acted. But what Atia has pointed out to me, and I think she's right, that this is not just a race issue, it's also a gender issue. It's about inclusion more broadly, and certainly within the OECD and in my patch, the US, if we had a lot more diversity, a lot more inclusion, real inclusion, not tokenism, but real inclusion in the international tax space, we would make fewer mistakes. And I would say that the cultural story of tax havens would be less persistent. And, I think using the persistence of the cultural story of tax havens as an example of what we get when we don't have inclusivity, where we don't get, unless we happen to have Charles Rangel being the head of the Ways and Means Committee in the US House of Representatives and President Obama, unless we happen to have a diverse set of actors creating innovative policy. And I'm quoting here from this article in the Scientific American, the scholar who unfortunately recently passed away, who looked at the evidence of what diversity does, right? How diversity works. Yes, it helps you make fewer mistakes because you have broader experience. But what the data shows is that when you have, is a study she cites, diverse juries. So when you have diverse juries, they do a better job, make fewer mistakes, they're more accurate, they deliberate more when they're diverse. And it's not just because, although it may be true, no, it's not, that more diverse people are smarter. That's not the point. The point is that they show that having diverse actors in the jury make everybody act more carefully and thoughtfully, right? So it's a different story than we think, right? We're not saying that anybody's better than anybody else, but we're saying we're all better when we're forced to think about what we're doing from different perspectives, right? That is, I think, the insight that that Atia helped me broaden out from this one little windmill I've been tilting at for 20 years, and to really understand that this is really about, we think tax is just intellectually challenging and hard. This is at least the way it's talked about in the US. And so we should just find the smartest, fewest people who are able to do the work. When in fact, if we want the outcomes that we see from the more diverse groups, we would want diverse groups. Yes, they should all be smart. Tax is hard. International tax is harder. But we want to make sure that we have a diverse group of people doing the work. And I think that's certainly Catherine Phillips' work shows that it needs to be diverse in gender terms, diverse in racial terms, diverse in all terms, so that we get the innovation we need, like FATCA. That was a radical departure from what we had been doing. It rejected the cultural story, embraced a structural story of tax havens to make real progress for the first time in a long time. So that is the aspect of the piece that we're talking about that Atia helped me see. She's just much more reasonable than me, and was able to help me see that this is not just a story about tax havens and about race. It's about international tax policymaking and the importance of diversity. So that's one natural breaking point way, but I'm going to go on if that's okay.
Sure. Yep.
All right. So back to one of Way's 6 excellent questions. So again, this is quoting from Sharman's book, and this is I think captures the essence of the cultural story, right? This is how you end up with the Guardian illustrating stories about the Channel Islands with Tropical Beach, right? This is just so rooted now in the popular imagination, certainly, and certainly in the imagination of tax policymakers and tax scholars, that tax haven is now synonymous with a certain kind of jurisdiction. And they're seen not as implicated in a structural problem, but they're seen as the problem, right? This is where we've now convinced ourselves that we are not dealing with a problem of international tax avoidance so much as a problem of low tax jurisdictions, right? That is now how we've sort of reframed the problem. So the problem is not tax avoidance, it's jurisdictions that don't impose enough tax. Right, that is now where we are, and I think this is why, going back to Wade's problem about guilty, why I see this cultural story as still having a pernicious effect on the way we shape international tax policy. So those who know what GILTI is, GILTI is the Global Intangible Low Taxed Income rule that the US introduced in 2017. And essentially what it does is it just taxes the worldwide income of US taxpayers, and then it makes it intangible income by just backing out a modest return that's fixed to the assets, the physical assets in this foreign jurisdiction. So the idea is we're going to tax the income that is shifted to the jurisdictions by just taxing everything in a low tax jurisdictions. And this is the part that I think Wei read in this, the short essay and said, I'm not sure you're wrong, but I'm sure you haven't explained yourself well enough, and that's entirely fair. So I make an analogy to the earned income tax credit, right? So, you'll earlier on in the slideshow, I quoted J.C. Sharman as noting that it was, Larry Summers of the Treasury who were very interested in this name and shame approach. This is something that is not often talked about in international tax policy, and certainly not in tax policy generally. In that same era was when the Clinton administration ended welfare as we know it. And so what does this mean in the United States? This meant that there was a big shift away from cash-based welfare that was paid just through the Social Security Administration to our earned income tax credit, which is a tax subsidy for low-wage work, right? This was all part of a response to a different culture story that Blacks in the U.S. were, the quintessential narrative here is of the welfare queen, somebody getting rich off of welfare. This was a response to that cultural story, which was not true, but it had a really powerful cultural resonance with the shift from welfare, which was viewed as, was racialized as Black and was viewed as subsidized, encouraging laziness and fraud and all these terrible things. So we switched to the earned income tax credit to push back against that cultural story. And instead we got the earned income tax credit. And this was by the same time, at the same time, by the same players, really, and this is also in the same era as the 1994 crime bill, which is now much reviled. Biden had to walk back his support of the crime bill and his criticism of predators. All of this was highly racialized. All of it was, these cultural narratives of Blacks as lawless, as lazy, all of these cultural narratives that are really not the structural narratives. And now in the U.S., thankfully, the U.S. is now, the Biden administration and Romney had a similar plan, are trying to shift away from the EITC model to more traditional helping people who need help because we think they should get help, although it's now framed in a slightly different way. It's framed as helping children, right? So the Biden administration is trying to enhance and make refundable the child tax credit so that we don't have to, we can avoid the cultural narrative by hanging this on children who are innocent rather than by making adults work for this. So what does this have to do with GILTI? I guess is what Wei is wondering to himself now. So my concern with GILTI, and I definitely agree that GILTI is a better approach than sanctioning countries like Liberia. But the problem with GILTI is that what it means by low tax jurisdiction, right? So when GILTI looked to see whether you're a low tax jurisdiction, it doesn't look to see how much revenue the government is taking in, right? It looks to see whether it has a US style income tax. And if it doesn't have a US style income tax, right, that's not viewed as a structural issue. It's viewed as a cultural issue. Oh, they don't want an income tax, or they don't have an income tax, so they can, attract multinationals. Maybe, or maybe they should rely on different tax instruments. There's nothing about country without income tax that makes it necessarily, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? So if you decide that countries without substantial, or at least a minimal income tax on corporations is doing something wrong because it is a low tax jurisdiction, and because you've defined low tax jurisdiction as a jurisdiction without the right kind of income tax, even if its revenues are not low, even if it is not a low tax jurisdiction, then the cultural narrative is still a problem, because it is going to affect countries that are most vulnerable. So I try to figure out what guilty means to a country that is really too poor to have the kinds of tax system that the US has. Does this mean that the US just gets to collect the tax from that jurisdiction? And to me, that is a structural solution that is flawed by the persistence of the cultural narrative, right? The cultural narrative that there's something that tax havens are doing wrong, that goes beyond the fact of what they're doing, that there's something that needs to be punished about being a low tax jurisdiction. So we're going to do that. I understand that the counter argument that I get when I talk to very thoughtful people who work on minimum taxes and advocate for them is that what minimum taxes like GILTI are doing, if designed correctly, are allowing the opportunity for these relatively vulnerable jurisdictions to develop the kind of corporate income taxes that would help them avoid being low tax jurisdictions. And that's absolutely fair. But again, that plays into the cultural narrative that that the ideal is the kind of tax that we have. And if they're not doing that, it's either because they lack the ability, or they're just not quite strong enough. They just need to be encouraged to become more like us. So, you know, would I take GILTI over sanctions? Absolutely. But I think until we really grapple with this cultural narrative of tax havens and how persistent it is, and how it distorts our policymaking so that we end up with a rule that is meant to punish a jurisdiction for being low tax, but not really for being low tax, for just not having an adequate income tax. And when they don't have that, we're just going to collect those revenues. So it's not even like a controlled foreign corporation system, at least in the US, where we will exclude active income in that jurisdiction, right? We're not even doing that. We're just going to collect it, right? If you don't have an income tax on, you know, we don't care. We don't. The low tax jurisdiction, it doesn't look at whether what your VAT is, or what other kinds of tax you have. We just look at what your income tax rate is, and that's the end of the examination. And I think that is a legacy of this persistent cultural narrative that can be traced back to this shift from tax havens as a place where bad things happen, to places that do bad things that threaten our way of life. And that is what I think is, and it's difficult, right? It's difficult. It's difficult for me to think about, you know, I have to do work to figure out, you know, I didn't just come across that article that describing between the cultural, the narrative, the cultural, the structural, and the nature narratives of racism. That's pretty far afield for me. And what I hope to do is to really help my tax folks think about these issues that are relevant, right? The crime bill is not something we think about a lot. The 94 crime bill that really has been traced to, been blamed for the explosion in mass incarceration, right? And that was a Clinton era crime bill, right? This was something that Biden voted for and supported. The shift from the welfare to the EITC is something that is closer to home for us, but is still not something we think about, and certainly not in these ways. And thinking about tax havens this way, it's just so easy to assume that what tax havens are is that they are a threat. Rather, they are implicated in a structural problem that there are better and worse structural solutions to, but there's not the Guardian should not be illustrating stories about the tax haven problem, certainly not the corporate tax haven problem that the Tax Justice Network has made clear is about European jurisdictions, overwhelmingly about European jurisdictions without beautiful beaches, rather than beautiful beaches. We should not be illustrating stories about that problem with tropical beaches. That to me is, I mean, it's powerful because it's so trivial, right? It's such an easy thing to do, and it's a mistake that we would not make in other topics, right? So you do not illustrate stories about terrorism with a minaret, right? We don't do that anymore. We know better than that. It's just too simple. We don't illustrate stories about crime with a random black person. We just don't do that. And this is not as serious as either of those issues, but to me, it is an example of why we as a community need to focus on this one problem that I admit that I am more upset about than most people, but also view it as a teachable moment, right? And this is what I think Atia has contributed most, especially to understand that this is bigger than that, right? Even if we decide that tax havens are just not worth saving, this is a reason to understand, a way of understanding how important it is to have a more inclusive international tax policymaking sphere. We should not have whoever you think should be in control of the technical aspect of it, whoever is controlling the agenda, whoever is contributing the ideas, it needs to be a more diverse group than we have. So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to hearing more, but I hope that I've answered at least most of Wei's 6 excellent questions. And I hope that everybody understands how helpful Wei has been in just a day by asking such incredible questions. And I hope that I get more wonderful questions from the group.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was wonderful. Thank you for answering my questions. Your answers are very helpful. So because I didn't expect to have my questions answered so quickly, I'm going to allow time for our participants, other audience members to raise their questions. And so you should feel free to raise your hand if that's, I think that function is working, or type something into the chat box.
Great, I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go.
Okay, great. So I think I see a hand raised by Richard Reinhold. So please, Richard, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Wei. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Rick.
I enjoyed your talk. I thought there was an awful lot to what you had to say. I could not agree. You know, as somebody who has been in this business a while, both on the academic side and on the and in the trenches, I see it really the same way Stephen does. I think that tax havens come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and to try to pretend that they all look like the Bahamas on a beautiful day is just way too simplistic. There's an outfit, a non-governmental organization called SOMO, S-O-M-O, who which is an acronym for a Dutch name that I couldn't possibly pronounce, that has done a lot of good work analyzing the situation of the Netherlands as a tax haven. And the Netherlands is a tax haven. And their treaty network, essentially coupled with their holding company jurisdiction rules, has been extremely effective in allowing the people planning, out of the industrialized countries to access cash flows on a very advantageous basis and including especially out of developing countries. So it seems to me to leave that out of any description of what a tax haven is just misses a very important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Richard. I think we have hands from David and then from Stanley. Professor Duff, why don't you go ahead first?
Thanks. Hi, Stephen. Good to see you again after a number of years. I really enjoyed the paper. It's quite provocative and lots of insights in it. And of course, always attending to power imbalances is really, I think, important to think through about international tax issues. But I want to pick up on an issue of that dealing with FATCA, because of course the power imbalance there is the power imbalance of imperial America and the rest of the world. I'm a supporter of the principles behind FATCA, but the way it was brought about really was pretty hard-handed on many countries in the world. You talk about putting pressure on the banks, but in fact, it was really pressure on states because, especially in the Canadian context and other contexts too, immediately what happened is the bank said, well, we can't disclose this private information. So legislation was enacted to disclose the information to governments, and then it was government to government sharing. And of course, then that's now evolved into the common reporting standard, but then the US won't join it. Right. So it's like, so there's something going on there that I think I'd like to see more of in the paper, because I think there's a kind of a lack of the recognition there of the US imperial factor in that process. So I throw that open to you, and I'd like to get your response.
So I'm sorry. So I missed half of. Hopefully I only missed the second half of what Rick said and the first half of what David said. But I'll try to answer both, respond to both. So I heard Rick saying supportive things, and I'm going to assume he only said supportive things. But the important element of what I think is happening here is that what I heard Rick saying is that the term tax haven is so broad as to be worse than useless, and I think it captures pretty much everything bad, right? It's sort of, if anything is going wrong in international taxation, now we assume it must be related to a tax haven, right? That is both on the corporate side, it's on the individual side. If it's something bad in international taxation, there's got to be a beach involved somewhere, and that's not right. What I heard, that I couldn't support that more. I would like to ban the term tax haven. I just don't think it's ever useful. And I'll give you an example of why it's not useful. And a fight I had with a very much smarter than me about this. I tried to persuade this person that rather than saying tax haven in their piece, it was a guilty related piece, they should just say the countries that they're talking about. Because when people read tax haven, they don't think the countries that Tax Justice Network calls the axis of avoidance, right? They're thinking of places with beaches. So I think we should just stop using it. I think there's a power to the term that make people reluctant to stop using it, but it's just seductive. So, David, I remember soon after FATCA was passed, and I'm telling you, I love FATCA largely because of what I see as the anti-racist rejection of this cultural story, right? It's not my favorite approach. I don't think that's true, but to me, it's just such a relief to have a structural solution to a structural problem rather than a name and shame or name and sanction approach to a structural problem. That it's just there's just such a category error. You'll notice if you look at my publications, there was about a 10-year period where I stopped writing about international tax entirely, and I've got to be honest that it was because I was kind of afraid and upset to write about it. I was at a National Tax Association meeting and presented one of my tax haven related pieces, and I had somebody come afterward and essentially suggest that why don't we just use military for this? I mean, these countries are tiny. We could just take them out really easily. And I thought to myself, come on, really? That's where we are? So that was part of it. I was also so relieved by FATCA and its rejection of the cultural narrative that I just said, this is fine. I can let smart people figure this out. We're moving away from the cultural narrative. I'm comfortable that we'll get to a better place. But I remember I was presenting about FATCA in Antwerp, and I must have been just a year or two after it was passed. And somebody's like, well, when is the US going to share information? I said, never. It is never going to share information. It's just, it will never happen. And, I think after the last few years of American politics, people finally will believe me when I say that. But the ability of the US to take positions that are imperial, I totally accept that term, without any self-consciousness is incredible. So I think that this is not an element of this. I do mention in the paper, but I didn't talk about it today. There's a great piece by some faculty at Mannheim about the role that the increasing purchase of the United States as a tax haven, right? They look at the bank data and they see that after CRS and FATCA and the lack of reciprocal information exchange, deposits are headed to the US, right? And that's just objective fact. And I think that is a problem. I don't think that's okay. I think it's certainly a problem that jurisdictions that behave in that way find themselves rarely on lists of countries that are doing wrong. So I agree with both Rick and David.
Yeah, so Stephen, let me just interject. I know that you dropped off for a little bit. Rick had a great question about the role of Netherlands, so maybe I ask her to repeat that.
Please, would you mind, Rick?
Sure, absolutely. And and it needn't be just the Netherlands. The point would apply with equal force, in some contexts to Luxembourg or Ireland. One needn't shame the Dutch, but by the same token, in my treaties class, for example, this year we're reading a report put out by SOMO, the Dutch NGO, on their tax treaty network with the developing countries, and they present in tabular form the average OECD withholding tax rates, and then the rates that the developing countries have had to agree to with the Dutch. Now, they don't have to sign these treaties, but there are a lot of reasons, and some of them are unfortunate reasons, why they wind up doing that. So the narrative really has two parts. One is that the Netherlands, which is, by most accounts, a high tax jurisdiction, is a tax haven. And second, it's highly advantageous disadvantageous for countries in the developing world. So, to limit the focus to these gorgeous beaches in the Bahamas, I quite agree, is just.
And I will say they are very nice.
I completely agree.
So I grew up there, but still, when I go home, I say to myself, "Wow, these are nice beaches." I get that. But I want to. So Rick, I agree with you entirely on this. And that there's been interesting work. I think we were both at Rebecca's NYU workshop about her paper about tax treaties. So there's been a lot of pushback. Martin Hearson and folks have written about and I know he credits somebody else for the term the poison chalice that treaties represent for developing countries. That's certainly true. And Rebecca Kaiser, who's now in Treasury, rightly pointed out that these treaties aren't necessarily great for developing countries, but why are we so sure they're good for the U.S. either? So, to me, that's part of the larger narrative of tax, or the larger focus of tax as just a really that the goal of international tax has been just the neoliberal goal of protecting the market, right? the goal of tax is to get withholding taxes as low as possible, because that is viewed as a self-evident good. And I think that that's certainly not true for developing countries. And whether it's good or not for the US, I think depends on what kind of US person you are, right? So if you are an essential worker, that may look one way. If you are, a senator or somebody on Wall Street, it might look quite different. And unfortunately, we often hear more loudly from folks on Wall Street than those who are essential workers. And I think that's a related question, Rick, that I think is important.
So Stephen, I'd like to steer you to some further questions from other audience members. There was a question from Stanley Amator, who is one of our LLM students. And then after that, there is Dimitri, I think, an audience member joining us from Germany.
Great. Hi, Stanley.
Stanley.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for being with us once more. I think I agree with Professor Dove that the article was quite thought-provoking. I think what I was reading, I was like, wow, I was just wow through the paper. So I just have a quick question. I think this may be a little bit unrelated, but I just want to get your thoughts on it about considering the fact that with the coming into effect of the African Continental Free Trade Act in January this year, which has been built to create one of the largest free trade zone in the world in terms of participating country. So I just want to get your thoughts on it. Although I know it's not on the it's not part of the article. If you think maybe having an Africa tax treaty to regulate African countries and especially developing countries, if you think having such an African tax treaty will help to solve some of these issues about dealing with African countries unequally in terms of with other countries. So I know this is a little bit unrelated to your work, but I'm happy to have this discussion on the side. If you think maybe you've not given a thought on it. So basically, if you think having a tax treaty to regulate African countries themselves, if you think it will help to solve some of the problems African countries are having on the international tax scale.
So that's a great question, Stanley. Thank you for asking. I think that what I want to say, and I think this is a great follow-up to the questions from Rick and from David. I think the question for me is what international tax policy should be doing, right? I think that I think that it used to be just the neoliberal vision that I think Rick is rightly criticizing. And I think the danger is that you have started to veer towards what David, I think, is rightly criticizing. It's really almost a neo-mercantilism, right? And this is, I give Rebecca a hard time. We used to be colleagues at Brooklyn Law School. No, I shouldn't give Rebecca our time, but there are papers written by others who really are debating whether guilty is America first enough, right? Debating whether I don't think guilty is really America first. It's really soft on other countries. It's really a gift to other countries rather than America first. And I think, I don't think that that there's I don't think it's automatically true that what a tax treaty should be doing is just advancing the goal of getting tax rates as low as possible. I don't think that's correct. I think that was once viewed as the goal of international tax policy. I don't think that's true. And I certainly don't think the goal of international tax policy should be to make the US win, right? We shouldn't be trying to figure out how to, make sure we get the most marbles at the end of the day. I don't think that is, I don't think that's a good long-term strategy. I don't think that's how we get to a stable global international tax policy. So, my response to you, Stanley, is there are a ton of wonderful things that an African tax treaty could do, right? There are a ton of things an African tax treaty could do, but it's important to think about what those should be, right? We had a debate in the U.S. and globally about tax bearing half a century ago, right? Tax bearing was rejected from from U.S. treaties as somehow inconsistent with the overall goals of international tax policy. And I think there was an implicit decision that what international tax policy was about was neoliberalism, and that tax bearing was not consistent with that. But I'm not sure everybody would agree that international tax policy is for neoliberalism, right? So I think the question for you, Stanley, is what you would want to accomplish if it's some of the things that I think every tax treaty can do, getting common terms established, avoiding confusion, trying to avoid undue burdens. That's all fine. But I think if it veers into either neoliberalism on the one hand, just tax rates as low as possible, or some sort of weird new mercantilist approach that David is worried about, where the strongest countries just insert terms of the treaties that they want and give them advantage over others, I think that's terrible. I think that's even worse, perhaps, than the neoliberalism. Because I probably, and you won't believe it after today's talk, I probably, if I were to put myself in any camp, I think I'm probably either a failed or recovering neoliberal. Because I do think markets are helpful, but I do think that markets are often tainted by the flaws of the people that are regulating them. And I think that's the concern. So I think I'm not anti-treaty per se. I think my question is, what do we want them to do? And so if you think carefully about what you want treaties to do, I think they can be an incredibly powerful tool.
So Stephen, thank you. That's very helpful. I want to tell you, Stephen, you actually have many questions lined up now. So we have to aim for speed.
Okay, I'm gonna go short. Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, yeah. And so I'm gonna, we have Dimitri waiting for a long time. I'll ask Dimitri, if you can make your question short, that would be great. And we have several very good questions in the chat box and coming after Dimitri's question. Dimitri, you wanna go ahead?
First of all, thanks a lot of being able to be here. I'm an MSc student at the Oxford University taxation course, now based in Hamburg. I love your podcast, so thanks a lot for that one. My question is actually just the same as Sarah's and Susanna's that was raised, apart from just raising and analyzing the problems. What about the solutions? So what kind of institutional frameworks are possible to move away from a hegemonic world where the US is the hegemon, and what kind of instruments, frameworks can we put in place to actually have a multipolar world? So would it help? Is there any chance for the United Nations take charge, a truly workable UN tax body? Because the way I see it, the OECD currently still reflects the powers of the global north.
So Dimitri, I think it's a great question.
Stephen, I just want to interject. So Dimitri just referred to questions that Sarah and Susanna put into the chat box. So I invite you to answer that question, because we have another question coming from one of our students that's from a very different direction. Maybe you can answer Dimitri's question, but at the same time as Susanna. Susanna from Spain asked, how can the international taxation arena be made more inclusive and diverse? I really think it's important, but how can it be done? And then Sarah, I think from the UK, says, what role can each of us play in achieving inclusivity and diversity in the shoes that we each walk in here? I assume that being tax professionals.
So this is, I think, all one question, and I definitely agree with the way you spoke them together. I think one of the most important things we can do is, learn the lesson that Catherine Phillips has tried to teach us for years, that, being smart without diversity is not enough, right? You need diversity to get better ideas, right? You don't just need to find the 5 smartest people in the world and ask them each separate questions. You need to get people with different perspectives together, and just people who are different together, because that is how diversity makes innovation happen. So I would say that understanding what diversity is for and why it's helpful is something that tax people just don't do. I know that the culture in the United States is that tax is a very difficult subject matter, and so that only the smartest people do it, which unfortunately sends a signal to many people, especially minorities in the United States, that this is meant to be an exclusive club of thinkers and not meant to be inclusive. So I think if we could be just at least acknowledge that we want more inclusion, I think that is an important step. I think that on the more structural solution, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a zero-sum game for the UN to gain power. It doesn't have to take specific roles away from the OECD. I think that the question should be, in my personal fantasy, what we do is we don't take away any authority from the OECD, but we have a rotating cast of Security Council like folks from different places telling the OECD what's important, right? Because it's not about the tools, it's not about it's not about the specific methods. And I think the OECD has an incredible talent pool, a lot of very smart people who are working there, but they shouldn't be making the agenda setting decisions. I don't think that's true. I think that what the best part of FATCA was that you had a nice diverse Congressional Black Caucus inflected crowd helping shape the agenda. And I think it was a very US oriented crowd and ended up steering into the mercantilism that David fears. And I definitely acknowledge that. But I don't think you have to change everything. I don't think you have to fire the OECD and replace them with the UN to get the result that Dimitri is interested in and that Suzanne is interested in.
Thank you, Stephen. So we have a challenging question from one of our LLM tax students, but I think I'm confident that you've thought about these issues a lot, Stephen. So the question is from Thomas. You can probably see it in chat box. I'll read it aloud for the sake of speed. Reading your paper in many ways confirmed my inclination towards class first based analysis. Instead of applauding the convergence of the Black Congressional Caucus and the Heritage Foundation, shouldn't we be skeptical of the convergence of identity politics and pro-corporate think tanks? You're critical of GILTI and suggest that it may harm developing countries. And it's curious that pro-business US Tax Foundation is also critical of GILTI. Insofar as many of us are primarily concerned with income redistribution and confronting corporate power, why should we not be skeptical that this race-based analysis simply serves as a smokescreen? So it's a very pointed question.
Oh, a great question, Thomas. We should hang out. I like this. And let me tell you why. This is why the persistence of this cultural narrative of tax havens as this sort of deviant force in international tax policy is so pernicious, right? I think that I try to imagine what could have happened in 2000 if the UN had been supervising the OECD, right? I don't think that Liberia would have ended up on that list, right? And I think if Liberia is not on that list, Charles Rangel doesn't sign the letter. And if Charles Rangel doesn't sign the letter, the OECD's plan works, right? Or at least goes into effect. And so to me, I don't know if I prefer that story, but that is what went wrong, right? That they weren't able to, they didn't have the people on staff who would know that Liberia should not be on a list of jurisdictions that's going to be sanctioned. They probably should have known that the US Virgin Islands probably should not be on that list either if they wanted it to not blow up in their faces. So I think that the conventional narrative is exactly what you say, that the right-wing think tanks were very smart and alerted the Congressional Black Caucus to this problem. And that's true, but if the OECD had done a better job, the Congressional, the Center for Freedom and Prosperity wouldn't have had anything to anger Delegate Christian Christensen or Charles Rangel with, right? So I think that if guilty were made so that it was less playing into that narrative, then that's also less likely to attract resistance from the left. So I do think that you should worry when you get the convergence of the far right and the far left. I think that's not helpful. But I don't think it means that that convergence is itself the problem. I think it's a sign of a problem. It is not the problem. I think, anybody who looks at that 2000 list and says that Liberia being on that list was appropriate, I think has a problem. I think that is not even close to reasonable, that they should have been potentially subject to economic sanctions. I mean, that's incredible to me. And I think that failure was a real problem for all of us, because it set back international tax cooperation by a decade. I mean, FATCA and all that good flowed from it, even though it's not perfect, was a decade after the failure of the original blacklist. And I think that 10 years is a really painful loss. So I don't disagree with you that 10 years is a problem. I don't disagree with you that getting anything that gets the Commercial Black Caucus together with the Heritage Foundation should make us all very afraid. But I don't think it's them realizing together that there's a problem is the problem. I think what they were jointly upset about is what was the problem. So I agree with you, but I think the problem is not, I don't think the Commercial Black Caucus was wrong. I think they were self-interested in a way that I think is hard for people to understand. So I agree with you, 90%, I think, Thomas.
Okay, let's see if there are further questions. We have about 5 minutes left at the most.
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask Wei, so I tried to answer your questions, but I'm sure I left a lot out. What are you still, what further thoughts have you had after that excellent list of 6 questions? Are there things that I didn't answer quite well enough, or things that you thought were confusing still?
I did have a further question, not along the lines of those 6 questions, but complementary to what we discussed already. One academic discourse that's increasingly prominent also in policy in the United States is combating multinational tax avoidance is big on the agenda. And so we know that Kim Clausing is playing a major role at the Treasury. So this discussion does talk about tax havens a lot. And I attended a seminar earlier, from last year, not earlier this year, last year, where I think it was Gabriel Zuckman who said, what is the benchmark? The benchmark should be every country has the same tax rate. And so relative to that benchmark, we want to measure how much tax avoidance there is. So the question was, how do you measure tax avoidance? What do you think should be the true distribution of corporate profits? And Gabriel's answer was that let's assume that the world has the same tax rate throughout, and then that's the benchmark, and we measure how much deviation from that there is. I myself not quite sure about this rapidly developing discourse, and I wanted to see if you have a view about that. Just partly because reference to tax havens is very frequent in that discourse.
Absolutely, and I think this is the kind of thing that, along with getting too old to be afraid anymore, that drew me back into international tax, because I think that this notion, this goes back to what I was talking about in the presentation, that there's something wrong about a low tax jurisdiction. We could talk about whether or not that's true, but I think the very narrow definition of low tax jurisdiction that is often used is very odd. That you could have, a lot of taxes, but just not, say, a U.S. style income tax, a U.S. style corporate income tax, which is difficult, right? Enforcement, I teach corporate tax. I know that's not an easy topic to teach, let alone for every jurisdiction in the world to have the same sort of corporate income tax. I think it's very troubling. And the question is, what then do they do about it? And I think what I could imagine, I know we're probably running out of time, but what I'm most worried about is when the US has a minimum tax, looks at a jurisdiction that has a low tax or zero tax because they don't have an income tax, and then the US decides that it's just going to keep that, right? It's going to collect that and it's going to keep it, right? That to me is a very different proposition than if they were to collect it and write a check to that government, right? If you're going to say, I think that everybody should have an income tax like we have and at the same rate, and if you don't collect it, we're going to just send you a check in the mail and you can cash it or not, but that's it. We're not going to keep it. I think if the notion is this sort of, again, this neo-mercantilist phenomenon that I'm now blaming David for, which is unfair. If this notion is, if there's, again, this is, to me, it's a very U.S. phenomenon, very settler colonial, that if, there's a famous case that law students read in the first year of law school in property class. I think it's Johnson v. McIntosh. I think so. I'm not sure. And we talked about the doctrine of discovery, right? So the doctrine of discovery is the special version of eminent domain or takings law. So when the settlers showed up, they decided that all this land was not being used. So we could just take it, right? And I worry that what GILTI is doing is looking at other jurisdictions saying, oh, they're not using that tax base, so we're just going to take it. And I think that's troubling for all the reasons that settler colonialism is troubling. I think the Indians would very much like their land back, please. And I do think that if what folks like Zuckman are saying is that tax havens need to be punished into compliance, or are again falling into, they're embracing this cultural narrative of tax havens, that it's not a structural problem that these countries don't have corporate income taxes, but that there's something deviant about them not having it, and they can be punished. And if they don't accept their rightful duty of imposing a corporate income tax at the same rate that we do, we can just take what they don't collect. And to me, that's really quite troubling.
Okay, one last comment from Rick Reinhold.
I just wanted to say that there's an interesting anecdote that arose in Ireland after the 2008 financial crisis, and they were under huge pressure, had been for many years, to raise their 12% tax rate. It frosted the Europeans that they could attract business with that very favorable corporate tax rate. And everyone said after Ireland suffered so in the financial crisis, they would obviously bring up their corporate tax rate. They didn't. They said, we're not going to do that. And it represented a real privation for the population. But the population got behind the government and said, we'll live with it. And they did. And it really established Ireland's credibility as a place to attract investment. And I think, the fallout of sort of an approach like Zuckman's, where everybody's got to have the same tax rate, is that everybody wants to live in the same way and has the same orientation toward risk and sacrifice and reward. I just think that's so simplistic and unfortunate.
No, I agree with you. And I think I would just add one thing to that. It's not always, it's a preference, right? Not every country is the same in their relationship to multinationals. I know that Jamaica tried to impose a digital services tax. And I thought to myself, what are we worried that Jamaica is going to beat up on Facebook? I mean, what exactly is that we're worried about here? I think that Facebook could probably take care of itself, and that we should just let Jamaica do whatever it can. I just don't, it's to me, and this is the problem. The problem of a lack of diversity, people not being able to understand that different countries are different in ways that are meaningful, and that a difference is not always a sign of deviance. You can have differences that are important, and that it maybe not excuse failures, but certainly help explain them.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. This is a really, really inspiring discussion. I really appreciate your making time for us, and also I appreciate everyone else joining. It's an excellent discussion.
And now I know, Wei, that whenever I have a really important Zoom, my internet's going to go out. It's just good to know that that's going to happen. That's, you know, now that I know that's true, I'm okay with it.
Okay, thank you. That's it for today's session. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll have a virtual applause for.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Wei.